And there it goes, or there it went, I should say, the Union Jack. Those scenes from Hong Kong's handover from Britain to China 12 years ago, when the flag was lowered symbolically for the very last time, and the Bauhinia and the Chinese flag going up as well. Handover Day is tomorrow, July 1st, and looking back, more than a decade. It's rather spectacular at times, boom and bust. Right after China took over, of course, we saw the Asian financial crisis. That gave way to the dot-com bubble. That was followed by SARS and the property crash, where property lost as much as 2/3 of its value over an extended period. We then saw a stock rally, sending the Hang Seng Index to an all-time high in October 2007. And a year and a half later, it was at a 5-year low. Question is, how has it done since the handover? Well, over 12 years, a 25% gain. That's not a great rate of return if you've been long all the way. Now, our guest today, Anson Chan, Hong Kong's former top civil servant, the Chief Secretary for Administration, former legislator as well, and democracy campaigner, and, of course, James McCormack of Fitch Ratings. Very good day to both of you. Thanks for joining us. Ms. Chan, if I could start with you. 12 years since the handover. A lot was talked about what would happen to Hong Kong under Chinese rule. A lot has happened since. Have things developed the way, or roughly the way, you thought they might?
I think on the surface, most people would say nothing very much has changed. Hong Kong is by and large still a city that works. We have an efficient infrastructure, and we continue to have the rule of law and an independent judiciary. But I think if you bother to look below the surface, there are certain areas of concern, particularly the increasing interference from central government's organs stationed in Hong Kong.
Can you give me an example of that?
Yes. We've seen blatant interference in the Legislative Council elections and in the District Council elections. We have Mr. Bao, the head of the research section of the liaison office, suggesting that we need 2 ruling teams in Hong Kong, one the SAR government and the other representing central government's organs in Hong Kong. This is a blatant breach of the one country, 2 systems and a high degree of autonomy for Hong Kong.
Do you see, I mean, people are always going to be making suggestions about how things could be differently, and some of those suggestions will be unacceptable and they won't come into effect at all. I mean, broadly speaking, Hong Kong has remained largely untouched, as you say. Those areas of erosion, are they a major concern? I mean, do you see sufficient support in Hong Kong for the things that you do not like?
Well, they should be a major concern because Hong Kong has its own mini-constitution, the Basic Law, which promises the people of Hong Kong a high degree of autonomy under the one country, 2 systems concept. Well, we would not wish to see increasing interference either from the liaison office or from central government. We would like to see a faster pace of democratization as promised in the Joint Declaration and the Basic Law.
Is the public support there for a faster pace? And I know you've been asked this question 1,000 times, but right now we're seeing a global financial crisis. Hong Kong, you could argue, has fared reasonably well. You only have to go out and about. A lot of restaurants are closed, but a lot of people are still out wining and dining. The jobless rate is rising, but it's not as high as it is in many Western nations. We're seeing money come in, as we saw, for an example, with the 361 IPO, which debuted today in Hong Kong. And again, money poured into the secondary offering, let alone the initial one. I mean, Hong Kong's fared pretty well.
Well, I agree. I agree that economically we've probably fared rather better than many other territories and countries. But as successive opinion polls have indicated, the people of Hong Kong do want to see a faster pace of democratization. Instead, we see the government continuing to drag its feet. It's put off its consultation until later this year, and everybody is waiting to see exactly what proposals will the government be putting forward.
I mean, James, if there was uncertainty about the way Hong Kong is developing, particularly in terms of its relationship with mainland China, that would be something you would deal with, because it may affect the credit ratings. I mean, do you have much concern?
Yeah, we do, actually. I mean, that's a major issue for us when we're trying to figure out the sovereign credit rating for Hong Kong and why it should be different from that of the mainland. We really do have to think about the one country, 2 systems concept and how that would apply to Hong Kong as an entity which is not quite sovereign, not quite independent, but autonomous in many respects, and autonomous in the respects that are important to us from a rating perspective, which means it has its own tax system, it has its own exchange rate, it has its own foreign trade relations. So those kinds of areas we haven't really seen any kind of mainland interference in at all. Fiscal policy is, those kinds of decisions are made here and not in Beijing. I think if we were to see any kind of erosion in terms of Hong Kong's autonomy on those particular issues, then we would have to think about what that means from a rating perspective, and should we really have two different ratings on Hong Kong and China. Up to now, we haven't had to deal with that.
And Hong Kong can retain its fiscal autonomy and its political autonomy to the extent allowed under the basic law, even though the economic integration between Hong Kong and China really has proceeded at a very rapid pace.
Yeah, that's correct. I think the economic integration has proceeded, as you say, very rapidly and to the benefit of Hong Kong generally. But it doesn't take away from that issue of autonomy and policy autonomy, which is critical. Because if Hong Kong didn't retain that, then it's just another Chinese city. And if you had a credit rating on the city of Shanghai, would it be actually different from the credit rating of China itself? The only way we can maintain these two separate credit ratings is to have this autonomy in terms of economic policy, the fiscal policy autonomy and exchange rate autonomy. So those issues are of critical importance.
Okay. In terms of going back to the idea of popular support for a greater pace of democratic change, there's a pro-democracy march, as ever, on July 1st tomorrow. You'll be joining that, correct?
Yes, I will.
Any idea how many people are likely to turn up?
Well, if the latest opinion survey is any indication, I think at the very least probably 70,000 or maybe 80,000, but there might be more.
Okay, I mean, this is very different to the days when we had 500,000 people turning out, of course. Does that worry you at all?
No, that was for a very specific incident and a very specific concern, and that was people were worried that enacting Article 23 legislation would undermine our rights and freedoms.
This was the security law.
Yes, and the rule of law. I think any numbers turning up is an indication that people have various grievances. It may not be just about universal suffrage. It can be about livelihood issues. It can be about the growing income disparity. And when you have this degree of unhappiness and disillusionment, even civil servants are taking to the streets, then I think the government should take people's concerns very, very seriously.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about how the government has performed, a little bit about your career as well and how that's developed over the years. Speaking to Anson Chan, the former Chief Secretary for Administration in Hong Kong. That's the top civil service job. When we do come back, it's your time on Asia Confidential as well. We'll be asking your questions. Our guest today, along with Anson Chan, James McCormack, Fitch Ratings, Head of Asia Pac Sovereign Ratings. Do stay with us. We're back in just a couple. Let's go back a little bit in history. On this day, 1960, the independent Congo is proclaimed by King Baudouin of Belgium, the former colonial power. It is now called the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's got to be known as Zaire in between. If you didn't know what the Belgians did in Congo, read Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness for one indicator. June 30th, 2004, the Cassini orbiter became the first ever to orbit Saturn. That was after spending nearly 7 years getting there, and the NASA probe is still there, studying the planet and its moons. And the ultimate bad boy of boxing turns 43 today. Mike Tyson was born on June 30th, 1966 in Brooklyn, New York. Iron Mike, the undisputed heavyweight champ, and remains the youngest man ever to win the title. He is retired now, and life hasn't gone at all smoothly since. Look at his career tally, though. He's won 50 out of 58 bouts with 44 knockouts, second to the record of the greatest of them all, Muhammad Ali. Okay, let's continue our chat today. Anson Chan, the former Chief Secretary for Administration in Hong Kong, former legislator, now democracy campaigner, and I guess James McCormack of Fitch Ratings. Very good day once again to both of you. Ms. Chan, I just want to talk a little bit about how your career has gone, because you spent 40 years as a civil servant,
yes,
ending up with the top post of all. You were a legislator for 1 year, 2007 to 2008, and you've been working as a democracy campaigner before that and after that as well. When you look at how the government is operating now, well, let me ask a different question, actually. When you went into LegCo, you had a very high-profile battle against Regina Ip, who was the protagonist behind Article 23, which we just referred to, which brought 500,000 people out onto the street, led to her stepping down. How do you feel she's doing in LegCo?
I think on the whole, Regina is performing well. She clearly knows a great deal about the workings of government, and she speaks sensibly and generally in a rather balanced way on most issues.
So you're a supporter?
And she works hard, yes. I give credit where it is due, but where criticisms are called for, I would not hesitate to criticize.
Does LegCo matter in Hong Kong?
Of course it matters.
You only spent 1 year there, though.
Yes, but LegCo has specific functions to play under the basic law. It acts as a check and balance against the government. It approves all government funding and passes all the laws required for the administration of Hong Kong. So it has a real job of work. But at the moment, I think a lot of members feel frustrated because of the constraints imposed, for example, by the way voting takes place in the legislature, by the fact that the government has this policy whereby it is pretty clear who are the friendly political parties and who are, as it were, the enemy. So you don't encourage genuine cooperation. You don't encourage genuine dialogue. And the government frequently shows scant attention for the proposals that LegCo members put forward.
Okay, it's a complicated voting system for people outside Hong Kong, but it doesn't boil down to one legislator, one vote, majority wins. That's the bottom line. It doesn't work out that way. You could accuse it of being a loaded system. Another issue which has been running as long as I've been in Hong Kong, certainly since you were with the civil service and way beyond that, is press freedom. And a lot of that is focused on the government-owned radio and TV service provider, RTHK. How do you think the government's handling this right now?
I think the government really should, as soon as possible, put out a consultative document that will set out the government's views on the future of Radio Hong Kong. At the moment, I think the staff and the future of Radio Hong Kong are in limbo, and that does not it's not conducive towards good policy making. So I think sooner rather than later, the government must face this particular problem, and it is a very thorny problem.
James, I don't want to skew this towards media, being a journalist myself, but it is an important point. When you look at credit ratings in places like Hong Kong, do you take press freedom into account at all?
Not directly, but I think many of the issues that we've been discussing here are things that we would need to look at peripherally to see whether or not, again, bringing it back to that issue of is the mainland interfering in some of the economic policies. They're not doing it now, but if they are moving towards that tendency in other areas, then that would, could be a leading indicator of what we may see in terms of an economic policy going forward. So not directly, but yes, I think peripherally we need to continue to watch issues like that quite carefully.
Ms. Chan, a subject close to your heart, no doubt, as well, is the civil service. And how do you feel that's being run at the moment?
I think the civil service, in terms of morale and efficiency, there are some real problems to address. I've always believed and continue to believe that the introduction of the political appointment system was a fundamentally flawed system, and no efforts have been put into ensuring that you can build up trust between the political appointees and the civil servants. Without trust, there is no cooperation. There seems to be less and less a regard for the core values that hold the civil service and indeed all public officials together. And these days, I think a lot of people can be forgiven for questioning whether the government, who exactly is in charge. It seems sometimes like a ship without a rudder.
Do you feel that trust has broken down between the civil servants?
Absolutely. Why are so many civil servants deciding to take to the streets? Now, of course, anything concerning civil servants' pay and pay structure is a very, very complicated problem. And this is one issue where if the government feels that the arguments are on their side, they should stand firm and not give way. On the other hand, if there are legitimate concerns on the part of civil servants, including the disciplined forces, which the government has not addressed, then the government needs to address this efficiently and quickly.
Just want to wrap up on basically what happens next from your point of view. Are you going to continue marching, or have you other plans to promote democracy?
I'm doing much more than marching.
Well, exactly.
Since I stepped down from the Legislative Council, I've started a tour, a speaking tour of secondary students and tertiary institution students to talk about one country, two systems, why we need to safeguard and defend our rights and freedoms. I've got 125 schools lined up for this.
Is the government happy with you doing this? Does it mind you going to schools?
Well, I have not heard heard otherwise. Secondly, I continue to work with my members on the steering group on the Citizens Commission for Constitutional Development. We're hoping to come up with some proposals about viable options in terms of the way forward. In the meantime, we are chatting up the business sector. We're chatting up members of the functional constituencies to hear their concerns, particularly on the abolition of functional constituencies. And thirdly, I believe it is very important to continue to stress Hong Kong's international connectivity and not just become more and more parochial and more inward-looking. So from that point of view, I'm going to do more overseas speaking engagements.
Okay, we look forward to hearing that and hearing the reaction as well. Anson Chan, thank you very much indeed for your time today. That's Anson Chan, the former top civil servant in Hong Kong.